Hi, I'm Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show. Also today in this segment, I'm at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and continuing episode 211 with part 2. What you see right behind me is Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22.
Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 was built by Alco in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1910 and is the 469/44th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive. Originally, it was built for the Marquette and Southeastern Railway as Marquette and Southeastern 38 in Marquette, Michigan. Then, in 1911, it was used by the Munising Marquette and Southeastern as Munising Marquette and Southeastern 38. Then, in 1924, when the Munising Marquette and Southeastern was merged into the Lake Superior and Ishpeming, it was soon renumbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 and was likely used to haul freight as well. Then, in 1963, it was sold along with many other Lake Superior and Ishpeming locomotives to a local tourist line called Marquette and Huron Mountain, and the locomotive as Marquette and Huron Mountain 22. Then the locomotive was retired, and in 1984, Marquette and Huron Mountain Railroad suspended operations and their equipment was sold at auction, and this locomotive got sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it had been going under cosmetic restoration, and it was completed in 2017. Also, Lake Superior and Ishpeming 22 is one of 11 surviving Lake Superior and Ishpeming steam locomotives surviving today, and all of them surviving are 280 consolidation types, and 22 can be found here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 60.
Copper Range 60 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1903 and is a passenger car. Originally, it was numbered as Copper Range 60 and it is one of 6 cars numbered from 55 to 60, and it had been used on the Copper Range Railroad for several years. The interior was originally stained and varnished with a golden oak finish. In addition to solid oak woodwork, the car had oak veneer headlining and ceiling panels. The seats were upholstered with rattan. During the 1944 rebuild, the oak veneer ceiling panels were replaced with painted panels and the rattan seats were changed to red plush, which are from Copper Range Coach 51. Then it was retired, and in 1982 it came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it was moved to the museum's new site in North Freedom, and it had been awaiting restoration. A new roof was installed in 1984. In 1993, museum volunteers focused their efforts on performing a complete restoration, and restoration was finally complete. And also it can be seen displayed in the coach shed as well.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 25.
Copper Range 25 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1903 and is a combine car. Originally, it was numbered as Copper Range 59, and it is one of 6 cars numbered from 55 to 60, and it had been used on the Copper Range Railroad for several years and had a green brighter than Pullman green and striped in gold. The interior of the coach was originally stained and varnished with a golden oak finish. In addition to solid oak woodwork, the car had oak veneer headlining and ceiling panels. The seats were upholstered with rattan. Then, in 1913, it was rebuilt as a combination baggage coach and renumbered as Copper Range 25. Then later the car was retired, and in 1963 it came to be part of the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it was moved to the museum's new site in North Freedom, and it was restored to the standard Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul orange and maroon paint scheme adopted by the Copper Range in 1911. Also, it was used on the museum's passenger train in the early 1970s. In 2013, the car was masterfully restored back to its 1913 appearance, both on the interior and exterior, following a 5-year restoration process. The exterior restoration included rebuilding both end platforms, reproducing the original buffers, replacing the steps, repairing the trucks, and painting the car. Also, it is sometimes seen being hauled on the museum's train as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago and Northwestern 10802.
Chicago Northwestern 10802 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1909 and is a drover's caboose. It was believed to have been in the number series of 1516 to 2181. This caboose was used on the Chicago Northwestern Railroad for many years and used as the train crew's office and was used behind freight trains as well. In 1937 it had been rebuilt and the cupolas were removed and the double sash windows had already been replaced with standard design in a 1923 rebuilding. The car body completely resided and a steel underframe was applied. It was repainted in a boxcar red oxide paint and renumbered in the 10800 series, but with only even numbers. In 1941, Chicago Northwestern adopted a new paint scheme for its caboose fleet, which was a bright vermilion red. The drovers eventually received this color one by one. They were also converted to AB-type air brakes and as required by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and this car was converted in 1952 in Norfolk, Nebraska. By the early 1960s, only 2 Chicago Northwestern drovers cabooses remained, and 10800 is at the Black Hills Central Railroad in Hill City, South Dakota, and this one was bought from the Chicago Northwestern in 1965. In 1968, it was painted a dull green and lettered for the New York Central for filming of the Swedish production The Immigrants. In the 1970s, the car sat in storage suffering the ravages of Wisconsin weather. In 1985, restoration began. By 1995, the car was resided and received a new roof and was painted and lettered as it appeared after its 1937 rebuild. It performed in freight train service for the Chicago Northwestern Historical Society's annual meet held in North Freedom, Wisconsin in 1995. The interior was restored and the trucks rebuilt a few years later. Also, it is sometimes in service and usually is on display in the coach shed, and it is occasionally used at special events to increase passenger capacity as well.
What you see right behind me is Montana Western 31.
Montana Western 31 was built by Electromotive Corp. In Cleveland, Ohio in 1925 and is the 1/30th diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a combine motor car. Originally, it was built for the Great Northern Railroad as Great Northern 2313 and used for hauling passengers on board, and it also has a baggage area, smoking compartment, passenger area, and opposite end control area. Then in 1940 it was then sold to Montana Western Railroad and renumbered as Montana Western 31 and used for the Montana Western Railroad as well. Then it was retired and in 1966 it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today, and also it operated for a while on the museum's tracks starting in April 1972, and then in August that year it was moved to Electromotive Division's factory in LaGrange, Illinois to help celebrate Electromotive Division's 50th anniversary, where at least 10,000 people toured the car, and then, after that, it came back to North Freedom, Wisconsin. In 1982, it ran excursions on the Chicago Northwestern Main Line from the museum in North Freedom to Devil's Lake. Then it stopped running afterwards in 1987, and today it is on display in the coach shed where it can be seen today, and as well it is the oldest surviving and largely unmodified gas-electric car built by the Electromotive Corporation as well.
What you see right behind me is Copper Range 29.
Copper Range 29 was built by Alco in Schenectady, New York in 1907 and is the 42-504th steam locomotive built by that factory and is a 280 consolidation type steam locomotive and is a C2 class steam locomotive. It was originally built to work the Copper Range Railroad in Houghton, Michigan, which was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It is one of 8 C2 class consolidation type steam locomotives that the Copper Range purchased for freight service. As business declined and locomotives were retired, the Copper Range utilized this locomotive for freight and passenger service. This was especially the case during World War II when passenger service was reinstituted. During this period, the Copper Range provided passenger service between Houghton and McKeever for a connection with the Milwaukee Road's Chippewa service to Chicago. Then the locomotive was retired later on and was nearly scrapped, but then made it past the torch and hid away in the Copper Range at the Houghton Roundhouse in 1953. In 1967, it was sold to Keweenaw Central Railroad, which is a tourist operation and used on their passenger excursion between Calumet and Lake Linden, Michigan. Boiler problems sidelined the locomotive in the fall of 1970. The abandonment of the Copper Range Railroad in 1972 forced Keweenaw Central to cease operations and move their equipment out of Calumet. It sat outside the ruins of the Quincy Smelter in Hancock, Michigan, exposed to the elements from 1973 until was finally offered to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in 2004, and in the summer that year, it was moved to the museum and then arrived at the museum. Also, it has gone under cosmetic restoration till it was completed. Also, Copper Range 29 is the only surviving Copper Range steam engine left in the world today and is on display at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Wisconsin Central 306.
Wisconsin Central 306 was built by the Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1886 and is a baggage car. This car was originally used for the Chicago, Wisconsin, and Minnesota Railroad and originally numbered as Chicago, Wisconsin, and Minnesota 25, and this car was used on passenger trains carrying passengers' baggage on board when it was used by that railroad as well. Then, in 1888, it was used by the Wisconsin Central and renumbered as Wisconsin Central 306 and used on passenger trains on that railroad. In 1909, when the Siouxline gained control of the Wisconsin Central, it was renumbered as Siouxline 1605. The car was originally built with open platforms and they were removed at a later date. By 1940, it was put into bunk car work service and renumbered as Zooline W951. Then later on the car was retired and then was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and in 1965 it was moved to the museum. Also, the window and door opening added by Siouxline when this car was converted to work service were removed by museum volunteers and new baggage doors were constructed and the exterior repainted to restore its 1900 appearance. Today, this car is on display and it has exhibits inside it, and it is preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern X582.
Great Northern X582 was built by the Great Northern Railroad shops in St. Cloud, Minnesota in 1925 and is a wooden caboose. Great Northern X582 was used for the Great Northern Railroad on the back of freight trains as the train crew's office many years ago. In 1963, it was then sold to the Minnesota Transfer Railroad and renumbered as Minnesota Transfer X14, and then was used as the train crew's office for the Minnesota Transfer as well. Then, in 1971, it was retired and was then sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today, and also it had been cosmetically restored to its original look, and it took 10 years as well, and it can be found in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Boyne City, Gaylord, and Alpena 1.
Boyne City, Gaylord, and Alpena 1 was built by Russell Carr and Snowplow Company in Ridgeway, Pennsylvania in 1906 and is a snowplow. This snowplow was used on the Boyne City, Gaylord, and Alpena Railroad in the winter time on snowy days many years ago and would push snow off the tracks, and also a locomotive would push it as it would clear snow off the tracks as well. In 1953, it was renumbered as Boyne City, Gaylord, and Alpena 1 with the Boyne City Railroad's reorganization. Then, in 1959, it was retired and later placed on display in the railroad's shop building as part of a museum. Upon the Boyne City's closing in 1975, it was auctioned off and then donated by the buyer to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. And also, in 1977, it suffered serious damage while it was being moved by rail to the museum grounds in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and heavy repairs consisting of replacement of the lower end of the plow backbone timbers were completed in 1981, and then it arrived at the museum and can be seen on display in the coach shed where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Siouxline 15604.
Siouxline 15604 was built by Wells and French in Chicago, Illinois in 1897 and is a boxcar. This car is one of 500 cars in that order that were numbered 15,000 to 15988, but in even numbers only. This car was used for many years on the Siouxline on freight trains for many years and hauled cargo such as wooden boxes and barrels. Then it was acquired by the Goodman Lumber Company for in-plant use at its Goodman, Wisconsin facilities. The car was renumbered as Goodman Lumber Company 206. Then, in 1996, the Goodman Division, Calumet and Hecla, Inc. donated it to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was restored in 1967 and returned to its original Siouxline number as Siouxline 15604 and seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern 3261.
Great Northern 3261 was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1906 and is a passenger coach. This car was originally numbered as Great Northern 271 and was one of 15 identical coaches numbered from 260 to 274. It was purchased for use on the Great Northern St. Paul, Minneapolis to Hutchinson, Minnesota branch that served the resort areas along the north shore of Lake Minnetonka. Along the line, at Minnetonka Beach. The Great Northern owned and operated the Swank Hotel Lafayette, which was originally built in the early 1800s, then later the Lafayette Club. It was then later renumbered as Great Northern 261. Then, in 1908, it was renumbered as Great Northern 3261. In 1922, fire destroyed the Lafayette Club and soon followed decreases in service and increasing fares. In 1926, this car, along with 8 other lake coaches, were taken out of passenger service and converted into stockmen's coaches. Stockmen's cars provided sleeping accommodations for the ranchers traveling with their livestock on a stock train, and this car was renumbered as Great Northern X791, and the seats and stained glass windows were removed and bunks were installed. In 1928, a steel underframe was applied to the car to better suit the car for use in freight trains. Then, in 1969, it was retired and was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and the car was restored to its passenger coach configuration and original number as Great Northern 271 in 1972 and was in train service. In 1990, it was removed from service due to a leaking roof and placed in the car shop for a much-needed exterior restoration. Then it was given its second number as Great Northern 3261, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train and people riding on board it while visiting the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Wisconsin Central 63.
Wisconsin Central 63 was built by Pullman in 1905 and is a passenger coach. This car had been used for passenger service on the Wisconsin Central Railroad and used on passenger trains for the Wisconsin Central Railroad. Then, in 1909, when the Wisconsin Central came under the control of the Siouxline, and it was renumbered as Siouxline 1941 and was used for passenger service on the Siouxline as well. Then, in 1935, it was soon put into work train service and was renumbered as Siouxline W323 and became a bunk car and foreman's office. Then, in 1964, it was retired and was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it was restored to its 1905 look, and also it is sometimes seen carried on the museum's train and people even riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is Duluth, South Shore, and Atlantic 18052.
Duluth South Shore and Atlantic 18052 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1916 and is a boxcar. This car was originally used by the New York Central Railroad as New York Central 258905, and in 1916 the New York Central system took delivery of 1,000 double-door automobile cars and had a 40-ton capacity, steel underframe, double wood sheathed sidewall construction, and a staggered double side door to accommodate the bulky automobiles. In 1935, it was then purchased by the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic Railroad and renumbered as Duluth South Shore and Atlantic 18052 and had been used for the Duluth South Shore and Atlantic Railroad on freight trains. In 1946, the railroad rebuilt into single-door boxcar and the original Vulcan T section trucks replaced and K brakes updated with Type AB. In 1952, it was converted to work service as a tool car for wrecker support and was renumbered as Duluth South Shore and Atlantic K21. Then, in 1961, after the consolidation of the South Shore with the Siouxline, the car was then assigned Siouxline Work Service and renumbered as Siouxline D281. Then later on, the car was retired and in 1966 was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it had been used in freight train service during special events at the museum ever since as well.
What you see right behind me is Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western 63.
Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western 63 was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1888 and is a passenger coach. It was originally built for first-class service on the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railway, and the interior finish is varnished cherry wood and was designed by Edward Kalana. In 1893, the railroad was acquired by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and after the takeover, the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western by Chicago Northwestern, the car was renumbered as Chicago and Northwestern 469. Then, in 1930, the car was retired and was placed on a foundation to become a yard office at Chicago Northwestern's Wood Street Potato Yard in Chicago, Illinois. Then, in 1970, it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it got restored and then put on display and scene preserved here at the museum, where it can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is the Siouxline Oak Park.
The Siouxline Oak Park coach was built by Barney and Smith Car Company in Dayton, Ohio in 1884 and is a business car. This car was originally built as a business car. It was originally built for the Wisconsin Central Railroad as Wisconsin Central Oak Park and built as a 31-seat cafe parlor car. This car operated as a first-class car, and also it had smoking rooms at both ends and parlor car seating in a center room. A small kitchen was located near one end of the center room. The interior woodwork featured fine cherry wood trim accented with bird's eye maple veneer. In 1909, the car was then relettered to reflect control by the Siouxline as the Siouxline Oak Park and was subsequently converted to being a business car for traveling railroad officials. In this configuration, the smoking rooms became observation rooms and the central parlor room was remodeled to contain a single large stateroom, kitchen, and dining room. Then, in 1929, the car's name Oak Park was dropped and the car was numbered as Siouxline 57, and in 1938, the car was again renumbered as Zooline W118 after conversion to a bunk and dining car for work crews. In this capacity, the car served for a number of years in Gladstone, Michigan on the wreck train. Then, in 1968, the car was retired and was acquired by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was restored to its 1921 era business car appearance and can also be seen on display in this spot where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Akron Canton and Youngston 3151 and Akron Canton and Youngston 3161.
Akron, Canton, and Youngston 3151 and 3161 were both built by Mather Car Company in the 1940s, and both of them are outbraced boxcars. These cars were both used by the Akron, Canton, and Youngston Railroad for many years and just prior to World War II for lease to Ohio's Akron, Canton, and Youngston Railroad. Many smaller roads such as the Akron, Canton, and Youngston found leasing cars financially and operationally advantageous. In 1955, the railroad no longer had need of the Mather-built cars, and they reverted back to the lesser. By this time, Mather had merged into North American Car Corp of Chicago, Illinois. The cars retained their Akron, Canton, and Youngston numbers, but were relettered with MCAX reporting marks. Then later on, the cars were retired, and in 1966, North American Car Corp donated both of the cars to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and were lifted off their trucks and placed on the ground to be used as a storeroom for locomotive parts and supplies as well.
What you see right behind me is Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C183.
Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C183 was built by the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad in 1906 and is a wooden caboose. This caboose was used on the Duluth and Iron Range Railroad as Duluth and Iron Range 83 and used as the train crew's office for many years and used behind freight trains. Then, in 1938, the Duluth and Iron Range was merged into the Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range, and it was renumbered as Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C183 and used on freight trains and used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1980, it was retired and was sold to a private individual and was moved to Elroy, Wisconsin. Then, in 1983, it was sold to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and also it is used as a bunk facility as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha 6110.
Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha 6110 was built by the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad Shops in Hudson, Wisconsin in 1892 and is a wooden bay window caboose. It originally had a cupola and it was used as the train crew's office for many years and was used behind freight trains as well. Then later the cupola was removed and it was converted to being a bay window caboose. Then in 1974 it was retired and was sold to a private individual and it arrived at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and today it is used as a bunk facility as well.
What you see right behind me is WisconsinCalumet 529.
WisconsinCalumet 529 was built by the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe in 1948 and is a pre-CE class caboose. This caboose originally worked for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe 2221 and was used behind freight trains on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad as the train crew's office. Then, in 1969, it was transferred to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe subsidiary Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad and renumbered as Toledo, Peoria, and Western 529 and even was used behind freight trains on the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad and as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1983, it was then sold to Joe McMillan and later leased to the Wisconsin-Calumet Railroad and renumbered as Wisconsin-Calumet 529 and moved to Janesville, Wisconsin and used by the Wisconsin-Calumet Railroad and used in freight service for a number of years until Wisconsin-Calumet was sold to Wisconsin Southern Railroad in 1992. Then the caboose was retired and it remained in storage until it was sold to a museum member and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin in 2000 and today it is used as a bunk facility as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 12476.
Chicago and Northwestern 12476 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1909 and is a wooden drover's caboose. This caboose was used on the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad for many years and used as the train crew's office and was used behind freight trains as well. In 1957, it was sold to the Lake Superior Nishpeming Railroad in Marquette, Michigan, and while it was in service there, it received diagonal steel braces at each corner of the car body and tie rod braces on the cupola to help strengthen the car for heavy iron ore train use. Then it was retired and in 1970 it was sold to a private individual and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin where it is seen today and today it is used as a bunk facility as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul X 918050.
Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul X9 18050 was built between 1958 and 1963 and is a bunk car. Originally, it was built as a steel boxcar, and its original number is unknown, and it had been used to carry cargo such as boxes, crates, and other different kinds of loads it may have hauled years ago when being used on freight trains for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad. Then it was converted to being a bunk car for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Bridges and Buildings departments, used as a bunk car for traveling crews. Then, in 1989, it was last used by the railroad's successor, the Zooline, and around that time, it was sold to private individuals in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and was stored there for several years. Then, in 2003, it was bought by a museum member and moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin in September of that year, and today it is used as a bunk car for museum volunteers as well.
What you see right behind me is Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 01601.
Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 01601 was built by the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul shops in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1929 and is an all-steel cupola caboose. This caboose was used for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad and is part of an order of cabooses numbered from 01601 to 01615 and is the first car in that series as well as the first steel caboose of the railroad and was used as the train crew's office when being used on the back of freight trains for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad many years ago. It was then later converted to as the scale test car inspector's residence and also when remodeled for scale test car inspector service, it was remodeled and it featured hot water, shower, tile floor, and double hung windows, and at some point it was renumbered as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul 91670. Then later on it was retired and in 1977 the car was sold to equipment dealer Hyman Michaels. A museum member later purchased it and in 1984 it arrived at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin and is privately owned and used as a bunk facility and a dormitory for volunteer crews working at the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026.
Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026 was possibly built by Pressed Steel Car Company, New Jersey in 1903 and is a boxcar. It was originally used on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Also, it is one of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Class XL design boxcars. It was then sold to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming and renumbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2026 and also it was thought to have transported mine cables from Long Island to Upper Michigan. Then later it was retired and it was later sold to an individual in Ishpeming, Michigan who used the car for storing hardware supplies. Then in 2007 it was transported to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin and some volunteers had located it along with the other in Upper Michigan a few years prior and targeted them for preservation. The two cars had been stored on an isolated piece of track behind the original Lake Superior and Ishpeming Depot in Ishpeming, Michigan for 40 years and when it arrived, it was cosmetically restored and today it can be seen preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin where it is preserved today. Also, it is privately owned by a museum member as well.
What you see right behind me is Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2011.
Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2011 was built by Pressed Steel Car Company, New Jersey in 1901 and is a boxcar. It was originally used on the Marquette and Southeastern Railroad. Then when the railroad was later merged into the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad, it was numbered as Lake Superior and Ishpeming 2011 and also it remained in the company use on the Lake Superior and Ishpeming into the 1960s. Then it was later sold to an individual in Ishpeming, Michigan who used the car for storing hardware supplies. Then in 2007 it was transported to Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and some museum volunteers had located it along with the other in Upper Michigan a few years prior and targeted them for preservation. The two cars had been stored on an isolated piece of track behind the original Lake Superior and Ishpeming depot in Ishpeming, Michigan for 40 years, and when it arrived it was cosmetically restored, and today it can be seen preserved at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C74.
Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C74 was built by the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad in 1924 and is a wooden caboose. Originally, this caboose was built for the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad as Duluth, Minnesota and Northern C74 and was used as the train crew's office for the Duluth, Minnesota Northern Railroad when being used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1937, it was relettered for the Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range Railroad as Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range C74 and was used as the train crew's office for the Duluth Wasabi and Iron Range Railroad when being used as the train crew's office as well. Then, in 1965, it was retired and was purchased by Mid-Continent Railway Museum members and was moved to North Freedom, Wisconsin. In 1978, it was then donated to the museum, and also it was carefully restored, and also it is sometimes seen carried on the museum's train and people even riding on board it as well.
What you see right behind me is Minneapolis and St. Louis 23655.
Minneapolis and St. Louis 23655 was built in 1947 and is a flat car. This car was used for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad and would be used to carry cargo that a flat car like this one once hauled on the railroad many years ago. Then, in 1956, it was renumbered to 16021 and the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad merged into the Chicago Northwestern Railroad in 1960, and the car was used by that railroad but retained its number. Then, in 1967, the Chicago Northwestern renumbered the car back to its original number. Then later on it was retired, and in 1984 it was then donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. It was used variously as an idler car for cranes and even storing large parts. Today it is preserved here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Pullman Standard 4.
Pullman Standard 4 was built by General Electric in Schenectady, New York in 1943 and is the 177/98 diesel locomotive built by that factory and is a 45-ton center cab type diesel locomotive. Originally, it was built for the United States Navy and was originally numbered as United States Navy 65-00408. Then, later, the scrap dealer Precision Engineering purchased the locomotive from the Navy and was sold to car builder Pullman Standard, and the locomotive renumbered as Pullman Standard 4. Then the locomotive was retired and in 1972 was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and is used for moving equipment in and out of the shop as well as cars in the yard.
What you see right behind me is Great Northern 6.
Great Northern 6 was built by Pullman in 1913 and is a generator car. This car was originally a railway post office car and originally numbered as Great Northern 90 and was one of a pair of RPO mail cars, and the numbers were 90 and 91. In 1926, it was renumbered as Great Northern 19, as well as the sister was renumbered 20 and was converted to being a mail storage car. In 1928, it was renumbered as Great Northern 200 and sister renumbered as 201. Then, in 1943, it was renumbered as Great Northern 6 and sister car was renumbered as Great Northern 7 and was converted to being a steam generator heater car. In 1968, the Western Pacific anticipated using freight locomotives to power the California Zephyr and purchased 3 heater cars from Great Northern Railroad, including this one, and was renumbered as Western Pacific 593 and did pretty well and proving more reliable than the aging boilers in Western Pacific's F units. In 1972, this car was no longer needed, so it was then sold to the tourist railroad Oregon Pacific and Eastern as Oregon Pacific and Eastern 593. Then the car was retired, and in 1988 it was sold to Weblea Inc. in Chicago, Illinois. Then, in 1992, it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was rolled to the museum. In 2001, it was repainted into Pullman green. Then, in 2015, into its colorful 1940s Great Northern Empire Builder scheme, and also it can even be seen on the passenger train, and it is used for heating the museum's train during the winter time as well.
What you see right behind me is Chesapeake and Ohio 50684.
Chesapeake and Ohio 50684 was built by Standard Steel Car Company in Butler, Pennsylvania in 1909 and is a 2-bay hopper car. This car was used by the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad many years ago, being used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars, and was mostly used to haul coal for the railroad. Then, in 1935, the railroad sold the car to the Wisconsin Electric Railway and Light Company and was renumbered E-134 for that company. Then, in 1938, it was then transferred to the Wisconsin Electric Power Company. Then later on, it was retired, and in 1977, it was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was used to store coal for steam locomotive use as well. Today, it is seen here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen today.
What you see right behind me is Green Bay and Western 4567.
Green Bay and Western 4567 was built by Vulcan Iron Works in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1905 and is a 2-bay hopper car. This car was built for an unknown customer. It then soon came into the hand of dealer Briggs and Turrivis, who then sold it to Kewanee Green Bay and Western Railroad in 1929. For many years, this car was used by the Green Bay and Western Railroad many years ago, being used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars, and hauled many different types of cargo, such as like rocks, coal, gravel, rubble, and many different types of cargo may have hauled many years ago. Then later it was sold to the Wisconsin Power and Light Company, but never renumbered or relettered for the company. Then later on, the car was retired, and in 1972 it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was used to store coal for steam locomotive use as well. Also, it was occasionally used on the demonstration freight trains to Quartzsite Lake, despite the museum's high tariff for coal shipments to Rattlesnake. Today, it is seen here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is seen today.
What you see right behind me is Siouxline 99085.
Siouxline 99085 was built by Haskell and Barker in Michigan City, Indiana in 1909 and is a wooden caboose. This caboose was used for the Wisconsin Central Railway, predecessor of the Zooline. Also, this caboose was originally used for the Wisconsin Central as Wisconsin Central 99085. Then was used on the Siouxline as Siouxline 99085, and also it would be used on the back of freight trains for both of those railroads and used as the train crew's office. Then, in 1967, this caboose was retired and was privately purchased from the Zooline, and in 1969 it was then moved to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and in 2014 it was purchased by the museum from the private owner and can be seen on display at the museum as well.
What you see right behind me is Western Pacific B63.
Western Pacific B63 was built by Colin Freested in Chicago, Illinois in 1927 and is a burro crane. This crane was used for the Western Pacific Railroad for many years and was used to move ties, rail, and other track materials along the railroad line. Then it was soon retired and in 1973 was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen on display today.
What you see right behind me is Siouxline 80944.
Siouxline 80944 was built by American Car and Foundry in St. Charles, Missouri in 1916 and is an ore car. This car had been used on freight trains with many ore cars when being used on the Siouxline Railroad and hauled ore as well. In 1972, it was sold to Flambeau Papers. Then the car ended up at Fraser Papers' Park Falls, Wisconsin plant, used for the interplant storage. In 1997, the car was donated to the Siouxline Historical and Technical Society, who then donated it to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and it was restored to its Siouxline paint and lettering and is seen on display at the museum where it is today.
What you see right behind me is Goodman Lumber Company 9.
Goodman Lumber Company 9 was built by the Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio in 1909 and is the 2143rd steam locomotive built by that factory and is a two-truck shay type steam locomotive and is a 36-ton class steam locomotive. It was originally built for the Swayer Goodman Lumber Company in Marinette, Wisconsin. The locomotive went to Goodman, Wisconsin, where a new mill had just been completed. It worked on the Goodman Lumber Company's private logging railroad until the main line to the mill, which was served by the Siouxline and was abandoned in 1939. After the line to the mill was abandoned, this engine switched cars at the mill until it was replaced by a Whitcomb diesel locomotive. In 1955, the Goodman family sold the mill and the locomotive was donated to the Historyland Museum in Hayward, Wisconsin. After Historyland Museum went bankrupt, it was then purchased by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin and moved to the museum grounds. Also, it was on the yard tracks for a while, and in the 2010s, it was soon put on display on the platform and was soon going under cosmetic restoration, and some components were worked on, such as the tender, the front pilot, and such. Also, Goodman Lumber Company 9 is the only surviving Wisconsin shay and is preserved here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it can be seen today.
What you see right behind me is Grand Trunk Western 750-50.
Grand Trunk Western 750-50 was built by the Grand Trunk Western Railroad Shops in Port Huron, Michigan in 1975 and is a transfer caboose. This caboose was once used as a transfer caboose for the Grand Trunk Western Railroad many years ago and used as a maintenance of way piece as well. It eventually was obtained by the Association of American Railroads and used at their Chicago test facility. Then it was retired and in 1996 it was donated to the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin. In 2002, it was leased to the Wisconsin and Southern Railroad and was repainted yellow by the railroad and renumbered X103 for Wisconsin and Southern and was used at the Madison, Wisconsin terminal for work train service as well. Then, in 2019, it returned to the museum where it is preserved today.
What you see right behind me is Chicago Northwestern 630-99.
Chicago and Northwestern 630-99 was built somewhere in the 1900s and is a hopper car. For many years, this car was used by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad many years ago, being used on mixed traffic trains or on a train with hopper cars, and hauled many different types of cargo, such as like rocks, coal, gravel, rubble, and many different types of cargo may have hauled many years ago. Then later on the car was retired and then was bought by the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, and was used to store coal for steam locomotive use as well. Today it is preserved here at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum in North Freedom, Wisconsin, where it is today.
Well, I hope y'all enjoyed learning about trains with me today in Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show. Also, I hope to see you all again in the next segment. And if you didn't subscribe to my channel just yet, please do, because the subscribe button is just underneath the screen. And if you did not give my Facebook page a like yet, here's where you can find it, as well as the Instagram page if you didn't follow it yet. Here's where you can find it as well. So please be sure to follow, like, and subscribe to those, because I'll sure appreciate that. So this is Matthew Lapp, host of Matthew Lapp Train Guy Segment Show, signing out. Till next time, all aboard!